So let's put this on big screen. And here's an example of a patient who's had myopic refractive surgery. And remember from last week, we talked about axial topography as showing us a curvature map. And if you look here, the colors are blue, which brings us into the flat zone. So this cornea has been significantly flattened. And if you look at the numbers, they're 38, 37, 40, which is below average. So you can already suspect that this patient has had myopic refractive surgery. But what really helps us to cinch the diagnosis is to look at the instantaneous, or the other name for it, tangential map, because the tangential map, if you remember, shows us change in curvature. And where we're seeing the greatest change in curvature after myopic refractive surgery is at the zone between the treated area and the non-treated area. That's why it turns up like this red circle. And that's useful to diagnose the type of refractive surgery that the patient has had. It also gives us a pretty good idea of the centration of the treatment zone. And if you look over here on the right, from the rings, it would be hard to distinguish exactly if this patient has had refractive surgery in the first place and what kind of refractive surgery they've had. So the color-coded maps really do help us out in that regard. So this is a myopic refractive surgery, and here's a different example. And just think in your own minds what this patient has possibly undergone. If you look at the axial map, the central curvatures are actually, they're in the orange zone. And if you look at the numbers, they're quite steep, with average cornea being, say, 43, 44, something in that range. These are above average. And the zone surrounding it is relatively flat. And when you look at the instantaneous map, we have this blue trough that surrounds the optical zone. And you can see some distortion of the peripheral mires here, because that's the zone that has maximally been changed. We'll for the time being, we'll ignore the lower panel just to concentrate on these three panels. So this is actually the opposite of myopic treatment. With myopic treatment, most of the treatment is in the center. It's like you take a bulldozer and there's a hill, and you take the bulldozer and you go across it with your bulldozer and you flatten it off. Whereas with hyperopia, what you're doing is you're taking a backhoe and you're hoeing out a moat all the way around the center, which leaves this bulging, steep area in the center. And I think that this really helps us understand why, one of the reasons why hyperopic surgery is not as effective as myopic surgery, and induces more aberrations, for instance, because the effective optical zone is so much smaller. Look at here in a myopic patient, if you measured from here to here, we're probably dealing, with 5 or 6 millimeters of optical zone, where it's relatively static, so this is going to be better from an optical point of view compared to this, where the optical zone has actually been quite shrunk. You're looking probably 4 to 4.5 millimeters, and even less than that in the center. And what we're really doing is creating a very multifocal surface with a very small optical zone. So it's going to be susceptible to very small changes. In other words, if you're not perfectly on the visual axis, if there's a big angle kappa, that's going to induce not only astigmatism, but it's going to induce aberrations as well. Now, looking at the bottom panels here, this is the internal OPD, which tells us everything posterior to the anterior surface of the cornea, which is mainly due to lenticular changes in most instances. But the posterior surface and the macula as well will contribute a small amount to the internal OPD. I just mentioned this now because you'll see it's important in one of the other cases coming up. And this is the classifier, the IA that's built into the system to help us hone in on the diagnosis if in case you didn't recognize it. This fits into the category of hyperopic refractive surgery. And here's a further example. If we look at the axial map on the left-hand side, instantaneous in the center, we've got flattening of the central cornea with kind of a bow tie configuration, and it's really not very symmetric. Just looking at a color-coded map, you could say, well, this patient has had some sort of myopic procedure, as confirmed on the instantaneous, where you've got this a fairly small optical zone, really, surrounded by the red ring, suggesting flattening of the central cornea. But there's quite a bit of irregular astigmatism. And here's why I like the Placido rings, is that the rings often will tell us, will give us information that you don't actually see on the color maps. And if you look here, there's one line going down that way, there's one line going down that way here, and harder to see on the superior side, but it looks like there's one of the incisions there. So this is the appearance of a patient with somewhat irregular cornea. If we were to try and peg the steep axis, we'd probably draw a line something along here. But if you look at the rings, they're quite distorted, and you'd expect that this patient would have rather compromised vision. If we look at this center map in the bottom, this is the wavefront or OPD scan, just looking at higher order aberrations. But I want to draw your attention to this little box in the right-hand corner that looks like a starburst, which is exactly what it is. This is what we call the point spread function. It's very subjective. There's no values that are put on it, but it's the imagined appearance of a single direct ray of light passing through the optical system and then bouncing back out. So in other words, it probably represents what the patient is seeing. And often I'll show this to the patient if someone that comes in with post-RK complaints or post-myopic refractive surgery complaints, I'll show them the point spread function. And first I'll ask them, because I don't want to lead them down the garden path, I'll ask them, what does it look like when you look at a point source of light? And they'll say, well, it looks kind of, sprayed and it's more this way than that way. And then I'll show them the point spread function. And many, many times, I can't tell you if it's 9 out of 10 times or 7 out of 10 times, but many times the patient will say, yes, that's what it looks like to me. So I think that's a useful way of trying to determine how disabled the patients are after refractive surgery or after cataract surgery with multifocal lenses. So those are some of the patterns that we see with refractive surgery. And now let's move on to some of the problems that we sometimes see and how the topography helps us to diagnose it. And here's a list of some of the conditions that we'll look at. Here's a patient we saw the topography last week, and looking at the instantaneous map or the axial map on the lower left-hand panel, it would be pretty hard to diagnose exactly what's going on. In fact, if you just looked at the axial map in the lower left-hand panel, you might think, gee, I wonder if this patient has keratoconus. We've got a steep zone in the center, it's steeper down, sorry, it's a steep zone inferiorly, more pronounced. There's asymmetry. Maybe this is a keratoconus, and the instantaneous doesn't really help us out much more. It's got all these kind of strange islands of red coloration that doesn't help us out much. And once again, the utility of having the actual images, if you look at the placido rings, it's quite obvious to the naked eye that this patient has irregular astigmatism, and this is a hyperopic patient who's undergone hyperopic PRK or LASIK, has the blue trough all around the center, and the epithelium, not atypically, is very irregular. And that also helps us understand why many hyperopic patients don't see that well for a long period of time. It takes a while for their epithelium, and remember, epithelium is the cornea surgeon's friend, because it wants to, for some reason, I don't understand the biology of it. I certainly don't understand the genetics of it, but epithelium wants to be smooth. I don't know if that's because of the effect of the lids, or it just, somehow it just knows what to do, but you got to help it along. You got to make sure that there's no lid abnormalities, that the cornea is moist, free from toxic medications, and then give it a chance to heal. And this patient actually ended up with good vision eventually. I'm sorry, I don't have a post topography to show you. I'm going to show you a case that was contributed by Dr. Slomovic. This was a 46-year-old female, status post uneventful bilateral myopic LASIK. Her post-op vision was 20/20 in both eyes. And then 1 year after surgery, she suffered blunt trauma to the left eye. And this reduced her vision to 20/40, and with quite high astigmatism on the K readings. And this was the clinical appearance. There's this white island of material. And then there's these series of radiating folds that's most evident on retroillumination. When you look at the patient just with the slit, this actually may look quite smooth, but with the retroillumination, it's pretty obvious that this flap has been dislocated and has what we call macrostriae. Here's another view of this island of whitish material. And this is at the interface of the flap and the bed. And if you look here, that is probably the edge of the flap, which should be actually over here. So there's been significant displacement of the flap. And with the wide beam, it's hard to see the striae, but you can imagine where they are. And here's the effect on the topography. Once again, I'm going to emphasize looking at the placido rings and how important it is. If you just looked at this, you would surmise what? This area is very flat. But in fact, that's not the case. The reason that it's interpreting that is that the computer had a lot of trouble picking up the rings because they were so distorted by this area where this whitish material is, which is epithelial downgrowth at the interface. So this is really not a true representation of the curvature of the cornea. And likewise, looking at the tangential or instantaneous topography, we don't have a big blue area there. It's just an artifact of the system that it didn't trace these lines properly. Now, when you're with the OPD, this is done with the OPD2 scan. We're now up to OPD3. With this, you can actually go back to the original scans and you can erase these lines. And then, or you can retrace them if you want. You can actually retrace these lines where you think they should be. And that will give you a more accurate picture of what the topography is doing. When in fact, it's probably not necessary to do that. In this case, you can see that looking at the DK, which is the difference in the SIM-K values, 41 to 35, and that's giving you 6 diopters of astigmatism. If you want to peg the steep axis, first look at the rings, and I would draw a line something like that, so at about 110 or 120. And here it's showing the steep axis at 106. So it's always good to try and train your eye. I've heard it said, I don't know who told me this, but I've heard that the human eye is capable of detecting about 3 to 4 diopters of astigmatism. And here, this is 6 diopters, so it's pretty easy to pick up where the steep axis is. So the treatment of this patient would involve elevating the flap, scraping out the epithelial ingrowth from both the stromal bed and the back side of the flap. That's for another lecture we can have on complications of corneal refractive surgery. But we would scrape off the bed and of the host and scrape off the back side of the flap, replace the flap, and make sure that there's good apposition of the flap edge to the edge of the keratotomy. And this has done a remarkable job in improving her astigmatism down to 2.5 diopters. And it's, of course, it's much regular. You'd expect that she should at least be able to be refracted to a decent value with glasses. Let's just see if we can go on. All right, the dreaded complication of laser refractive surgery, ectasia. This is that we don't really know the incidence of this because it's hard to know how many millions of people have undergone either PRK or LASIK for either hyperopia, myopia, or astigmatism. So we don't really know what our N is, and therefore it's hard to calculate the incidence of ectasia. There may be predispositions, and for that reason, we spend hours going over topographies and going over tomographies to see if we can try and identify in advance those patients who are at risk, those that have preclinical keratoconus, or some people call that form Frust keratoconus, or some other irregularities like an asymmetric bow tie pattern, or even high astigmatism or even high K readings, I think are a red flag. And when we're looking at a patient for refractive surgery, you know, we often use the baseball analogy, 3 strikes and you're out. So if you find 3 abnormal things, if you find that there's a high posterior elevation and there's inferior steepening and high astigmatism, you might say that patient has 3 strikes. Or let's say one of the strikes is that they've got a 1st-degree relative with keratoconus and they've got a couple abnormalities on topography. That might be enough to say, maybe you shouldn't have refractive surgery. And there's also some surgical risk factors. You can have recut flaps, microkeratome flaps. I believe, although I don't think we have any data to prove it, but I think that perhaps microkeratome flaps are a higher risk for ectasia because we simply can't control the shape and the thickness of a microkeratome flap. The standard deviation of cutting with the microkeratome is much higher than it is with femtosecond laser. And also, you know, high corrections where we've removed too much tissue or even regular corrections where we haven't observed the residual stromal bed thinness. And that number is a floating number. Barricare 70 years ago suggested that 250 or approximately half the corneal thickness should be preserved. And, but I think now, certainly for the last 10 years, I rarely will go below 300 microns just to stay on the safe side. And here's a patient who showed up with this appearance. If you look at the axial topography, by now you should easily be able to recognize this as either inferior steepening or corneal ectasia. Look at the difference in corneal curvature. It's 48 on the inferior spot, whereas on the corresponding superior spot, we're looking at 40. So, you know, you've got 8 diopters of difference, and here it's the artificial intelligence is categorizing it as other, but I think by now you should recognize that this is a pattern of that we would see with keratoconus or with corneal ectasia. And this was indeed a patient who underwent LASIK and several years later then developed ectasia. And here's one that I'm not too proud of. This was a patient of mine that came in after LASIK, and when I looked back, this was a long time ago, I must admit, and we weren't as knowledgeable, we didn't have as much experience, and we didn't have tomography either at the time. All we had was ultrasonic pachymetry. But when I looked back in the chart over the old topographies, there was evidence of abnormalities in the topography that we said, oh, well, it's probably nothing, and he's not a high correction, et cetera, et cetera. So we went ahead and did LASIK, and he came back several years later with the post-LASIK ectasia. And the good news is that we were able to correct it with DALK, but that's a pretty major procedure to go through for someone who came in to get rid of their glasses. So the bottom line with ectasia, take-home points are it's best to prevent ectasia rather than cause it. And you can prevent it by doing good screening, taking caution in high myopes, examining the topography carefully. And if you do happen to cause it, and I can think of 2 of my patients over the past more than 20 years that I've been doing LASIK. If you do happen to cause it, then we do have treatment. I caution you, just remember, we have treatment, we don't have a cure. So no matter, even in the best scenario, it's rare to return that patient to 20/20 vision, certainly to try and get them to 20/20 uncorrected. But the modalities that we use, you're all familiar with: rigid contact lenses or even soft contact lenses in some instances, scleral contact lenses. Cross-linking is very effective at preventing further ectasia. Intacs or topo-guided PRK work very well in improving the situation. And in some instances, you need to go on to DALK or PKP, a penetrating graft, in order to remedy the situation. Here's a bit of a challenge for you. I want you to look carefully at these. I'll give you a couple seconds to look it over. On the left-hand side is the topographical map. And this is the instantaneous upper left, and the lower left is axial. So you're looking at that, it's trying to figure out what it is. Maybe this is ectasia, right? Could that possibly be an area where the cornea is bulging? But on the axial map, it actually shows that the curvatures are lower rather than higher. And I think the key here is to look, once again, if you learned anything from this lecture, it's that color-coded maps are nice and they're pretty to look at, but they don't give you all the information. And sometimes just going back to your Placido images can help you divine what's going on there. And I'll bring your eye to a circular line like this, and then it's straight across there at the bottom. Now, let me give you a little bit of history on this gentleman. He went overseas, and for the price of doing LASIK in Ontario, he was able to get a return ticket to the Far East, and had his LASIK done overseas. And when he came back for his post-op visit to the laser center, they said everything is fine. Just excuse me for a second. Okay, I thought maybe there were some questions coming through. Gisela, there's some questions.
There's one, yeah, there's a question, but I was waiting until you finished this case. So Dr. Teitman's asking, have you used topo-guided PRK in post LASIK ectasia? He has been afraid to ablate more tissue, even though combined with cross-linking.
I have. I don't have a huge experience with it. I've done a few cases. And I think it's quite safe to do it because you're ablating the flap anyhow, which isn't firmly attached to the underlying stroma. So I don't think you're going to make the ectasia worse. And, you're rarely taking off more than 30 to 50 microns of tissue. So I have had good success with Intacs, which I like Intacs for the reason that you're actually supplementing to the cornea. You're putting in another piece of plastic. The downside of Intacs is you're putting in a piece of plastic, that's going to be in the cornea for many, many years. So they've both got advantages and disadvantages. But I think, it's, if the cornea is not very irregular, they do well with topo-guided laser or with Intacs. Okay, let's get back to this case here. And I think he went back for his first post-operative visit, and they told him everything's fine, go back to Canada, we don't want to ever see you again. And he comes to see us, and his vision is very poor in this eye, and you wonder what the heck is going on. And in the next lecture, I'll show you the tomography of this patient. But actually, what there is the flap is folded over on it, folded under itself. So somehow in the post-operative period, the flap went underneath on itself, and that's what that curved line is the flap going underneath, and the flat line is where it's folded on the cornea. And after refractive surgery, we can utilize the topography to gauge our effect, look at the centration that is usually pretty obvious. And we can also use it to gauge changes due to cataract formation. And that's not a direct link to topography. Topography doesn't tell us that, but some of the machines, the one I particularly like is the OPD scan, can give us that information. And so it's sort of an added on bonus, and it doesn't come with every topography device that you have. So here's that patient that we saw before after myopic LASIK, and I'm not going to belabor the point, showing you the beautiful, well, it's pretty good centration based on the visual axis, maybe slightly temporal in this right eye. Now, in the early days of PRK, there was no such thing as eye tracking. And when you did a PRK, you had to have the patient fixate on a fixation light. And then you, as the surgeon, would look down the scope and monitor that the patient was actually looking in the correct direction. Or when I started, what we used was Thornton ring, that you would reach around with your other hand and place the Thornton ring on the limbus to try and make sure the eye didn't move and monitor the position. But if you had a patient like this that was actually a high myope, look how flat the cornea is, a very high myope, and if they're looking in the wrong direction, then you're going to end up with a situation like this, where the optical zone is actually way off center. And this one happens to be decentered superiorly, so the patient was probably looking downwards at the time of the ablation. And in this case, it's downwardly decentered down and in. So the patient was probably looking up and out a little bit, which led to this decentration. Now, decentration can still occur when there's a disparity between the center of the pupil and the visual axis. Some of the lasers, like for instance, the Vizix, tends to center on the pupil. Now, if you've got a patient who's got a larger angle kappa, then centering on the pupil, it may not be the right place to put your laser ablation, and you'll end up inducing either higher order aberrations, or you'll introduce some coma, some vertical or horizontal coma that will translate refractively to astigmatism or to cylinder. At any rate, getting back to this patient, she was about a -10, -12, and underwent PRK. And this was a patient I saw a long time ago. I'm trying to see if there's a date on it. It's probably at least 15, 20 years old, and the laser was done much before that, and ended up with this decentered ablation. Here's, whoops, I should have blotted out the name here, but this one was from 2000, showing the decentered ablation. And this was one of my patients who, despite my attempts at centering the ablated zone, has ended up with a slightly decentered ablation. Now, this is fixable. This is the Nidec Final Fit software that pairs with the Nidec, I think it's EC5000, that we had when I started doing refractive surgery. And it actually was very good from a topo guided standpoint. It was very easy to understand, very easy to use. Here is the instantaneous map pre-op, and this is showing us the predicted post-operative map. And you can see it breaks it down. This is the ablation pattern planned. This is the spherical part of it, the cylindrical part, and then the irregular part of the ablation. And this is the post-op effect. And if we compare that to the pre-op, you'll notice that the zone has been expanded. There's been ablation down in this area to give us a better topographic appearance. And this patient actually did really well from a decentered ablation. And here's a hyperopic ablation post PRK, and a little bit of irregularity. Seems to be more ablated up above than down below. Now, in cataract surgery, we can use the topography to help us determine the corneal power if the patient's had refractive surgery. And it can give us help with the choice of what kind of IOL to put in, whether we want a negative spherical aberration lens like the Alcon or the J&J lens. It can help us identify the steep axis for incision placement if we're going to do limbo relaxing incisions. It can help us define the axis for a toric lens. And likewise, if you've got certain add-ons with the topography, it can help you verify the toric axis of your toric lens. And here's an example of the the cataract printout that we get when we're using the topography to plan our cataract surgery. And if you look at the middle panel here, it tells us the steep axis, the flat axis, and the amount of astigmatism. And on the topography, the steep axis is identified as being in the vertical meridian here. Here, if you look, the purple or the magenta line tells us the total amount of astigmatism, and it corresponds fairly well to what we see on the cornea. And if we hone down in this box here, it also gives us a value of the spherical aberration. And here, in this case, it's positive 1.86. So we can likely choose a negative spherical aberration lens that will help to neutralize that value. And there's the steep axis once again. Now, here's an interesting case. I didn't have an IOL picture to show you, but this is an ICL. And this was a patient who had myopic toric ICLs in both eyes. And in one eye was spot on 20/20 and amazingly happy. These patients that go from -11 to plano, you can't imagine how much it affects their world. And they're the most grateful and happiest patients. I never started out in ophthalmology with the goal of correcting myopia, but someone who's -11 is as disabled as someone who's a +6, +8. So it's a real disability, and often the patients are afraid to go swimming, they're afraid to go boating, they're afraid that they're going to lose their glasses or their contact lenses, they won't be able to see their kids in the swimming pool. So there's a lot of disability caused by high myopia. At any rate, the patient's right eye did well. The left eye, she was not as happy with. She was around 20/40, 20/50 vision. And if you look here, there's a little diamond shape mark. And here's another diamond shape mark on this side. That represents the axis of the lens. And here's the edge of the ICL on both sides here. So this identifies the axis. It's somewhere around 150. And what we did was rotate the lens. And this is a picture that was taken immediately after the patient left the operating room with retroillumination. What's obvious is that the diamond is now much closer. It's not perfect, but it's much closer to the axis of the astigmatism. And what's interesting is, so that's the axis of the astigmatism there. Actually, this should come down a little bit to show us where the diamonds are. If you look at the internal OPD, remember I mentioned this, that it actually gives us a reading of everything posterior to the tear film. So this is the internal OPD. And what it tells us is the total amount of astigmatism is here. This is the corneal flat axis. And this is the internal astigmatism. And it's at about axis 63. And if you remember where the axis of the lens was, it was at 150. So it's at 90 degrees to where the internal axis of the lens is, which makes sense. The total vector of the astigmatism is here. Now, this is what it looked like afterwards. The internal axis is now almost at right angles to the flat axis of the cornea, and the total astigmatism has now shifted from being here to being here at about 170. And immediately after surgery, her vision was improved to 20/25, and she was quite happy. And I don't think she's been back. So, you know, she hasn't been back to the OR, that's for sure. So she's quite pleased with it. Now, what about after corneal surgery? We can utilize topography for making the diagnosis of keratoconus and deciding on if a patient is a good candidate for cross-linking. We can also utilize it to look at the post-operative effects of cross-linking. This is one of our patients who underwent cross-linking. You can see this is from 2009. This is what the patient looked like pre-op. Has sort of this kidney bean shape, very, very steep cornea with 13.5 diopters of astigmatism. And this was post-operatively. I'm not sure how long post-operatively, but what you notice is that the kidney bean is now smaller. And the amount of astigmatism has gone down a little bit. If you look at the SIM-Ks, compare this 57 to 62 and 44 to 48. So this patient has flattened their cornea approximately 5 diopters of curvature, which is pretty significant. And this can continue for 18 months to 2 years after the surgery. So we know that this will improve their best corrected and uncorrected acuity. And also, I started to cross-link these patients and cross-link both eyes, even if one eye is very far gone. And I have no data to support this, and probably the next generation of corneal surgeons will be able to prove whether this is true or not. But to me, it makes sense to cross-link, even if you know you're going to go on to a DALK or a PKP, because you want to be sewing the new cornea into a more stable situation, one where the cornea has been cross-linked. Are there any questions, Giselle? I heard my phone beep for a second.
No, not here in the chat.
Okay. And here's an example of a patient who underwent Intacs. Now we do, almost always I'll do combined Intacs with cross-linking. In 2004, we had Intacs, but we didn't have cross-linking. But since 2008, almost all of our patients, we undergo, if they're going to go with Intacs, we do it simultaneously, do the cross-linking immediately after placing the Intacs, which is more convenient for the patient. And actually, there's a synergistic effect of the two treatments, that you get more flattening by doing the Intacs with the cross-linking on the same day. And here's an example. This is the pre-op, the kidney bean, I like to call it. The axial one, the tangential map shows us where the steepest part of the cornea is and where the maximal part of the cone is. And then when we look at the post-operative assessment, this is, let me see, this was done in May 2007. Oops, sorry, 2007. This is December 2006. So this is a mere 5 or 6 months later. the kidney bean is almost disappeared. And on the tangential or instantaneous map, you see that it's much smaller. So this translates into better optics for the cornea. And just a clinical pearl is that these interventions are good when the keratoconus is not too far gone. When the keratoconus is too far gone, then Intacs or topo-guided LASIK or just cross-linking alone are not going to do that much for the vision. But when you've got mild to moderate keratoconus, then improving the optics a little bit can make a big difference for the patient. And this is one instance of that. And of course, I learned the lesson the hard way by doing Intacs on keratoconus that was fairly far advanced when I first started doing Intacs, and then realizing that it's not of any great benefit. Here's another example in corneal surgery, how we can use topography. This patient, despite having a clear corneal transplant, has a very, very large amount of astigmatism, 22 diopters. And for example's sake, the steep axis is somewhere around here. It measures at 53 degrees, but I think it's always good practice to look at the rings and in your own mind, try and figure where the steep axis is. So this is the patient preoperatively, and I don't know if I've got a post-operative picture, but what I did in this instance, because the astigmatism was greater section, taking out a wedge of tissue in the flat axis. So at right angles to the flattest axis of the cornea, I took out a wedge of tissue, sewed it back together again. Then you got to wait, 6 months to a year for it to heal, and then you can selectively start to remove the sutures. Whereas if the astigmatism is lower, even up to 15 diopters, we can do femtosecond assisted astigmatic keratotomy. One of the hardest things I find in corneal surgery is cutting freehand a perfect arc. I'm not very good at it, even with a nice sharp diamond knife, but I'm pretty good at it when I use the intralays. And you can look at the picture on the left here. This patient had a penetrating graft with a high degree of astigmatism, and we've got these two beautiful perfect arcs that are symmetric, parallel to the keratoplasty wound. And on OCT, you can notice that even the depth is so predictable. You can measure this preoperatively with ultrasound, and then you can set your laser to cut down just to the perfect spot. And even sometimes doing that, you end up with perforations, but generally not. And here's a clinical example. This patient has high astigmatism with the axis at about 165. Look at the rings. They're quite oval. So we're looking at 11 diopters of astigmatism. And this is after the first treatment. The astigmatism was reduced down to 5.69. The center circle is much more round, much regular. And in this patient's instance, I actually went back a second time and were able to reduce his astigmatism to an amount correctable with glasses. And here's another example with a corneal scar after a Pseudomonas ulcer. Now, if you were to look at this, you'd say, maybe this patient had a PRK, and the patient was looking up at the time or something, up and in, and that caused this big flat zone. Well, look at the rings. And it's telling. Not only do we see that it's very flat in this zone, that's due to tissue loss. But look, it's a little bit hazy as well, though this isn't the best way to diagnose haze. But this patient actually had a pseudomonas ulcer and has quite a bit of irregular astigmatism and induced astigmatism as a result of the loss of tissue. And this may give us the information to, or give us the gumption to proceed with a topo-guided procedure to try and correct their vision rather than jumping straight in with a DALK or a PKP. So this is the last slide, and I like showing the examples because I think it really makes things stick much better. But just to remind us that the topography is the basis of modern anterior segment surgery, and it's useful, very, very useful in refractive surgery. It's very helpful for the cataract surgeon. Personally, I wouldn't put in a toric lens based simply on keratometry or based on the auto Ks that you get with the IOL Master or the Lens Star. And in corneal surgery, of course, it's indispensable and has really given us an excellent understanding of what happens when you cut the cornea, when you cut it the wrong way, when you take out too much, when you don't take out enough. It really gives us a good feeling for all of that stuff. So we've got a few minutes left for questions, if anybody.
Yeah, so
Sorry, you muted.
yeah, sorry. So yeah, so Sarah's asking if you can go over the concept of internal OPD again and what's the value of that. I think that's not so clear because not everybody uses it all the time.
Okay, well, the OPD scan is more than just a topographer. The topography is obtained by the circles that are reflected off of the cornea, and then it computes the curvatures, right? So that gives us the anterior surface. But the OPD stands for optical path difference. What it's measuring is it's like a I've forgotten the name of the device we use. It's been so long since I used it. It's the equivalent of a streak retinoscope. It's the modern version of a streak retinoscope. So it scans across the cornea with a streak, and it measures the changes, and that's why it's called optical path difference. It measures those changes, and that's why it's so good at refraction. It's usually very, very close to what we expect. But it's a wavefront device. You know, there's different ways of measuring a wavefront, and the retinoscope is a primitive wavefront device. It's a damn good wavefront device, and I'm sorry that we don't use it more often now. We've moved away from it. But it gives you the entire optical system from the surface of the tear film to the macula, everything. So if you take the placido, which gives us the curvature of the anterior surface, and subtract that, you subtract the anterior information, it leaves you with everything going on behind the cornea. The posterior surface of the cornea, anterior surface of the lens, posterior surface of the lens, foveal curvature, all of that. So that's what the internal OPD gives us. If you're looking at the toric lens, some of the information comes from the posterior surface of the cornea, but it's not very much. I mean, it's maybe 5% in extreme cases. There's the rare case where things are way out of whack because of the posterior surface of the cornea. It doesn't really contribute very much astigmatism. So and the fovea as well doesn't. So it really tells you what's going on with the lens, either the natural lens of the eye, or in the case of a toric lens, it tells you what the power is. So for instance, it's really useful if you can't dilate, if the pupil will not dilate enough to give you the marks that you can actually see where the axis of the cylinder is. So even in a small pupil, you can figure out where that toric lens is. Does that make sense? Tanya, you're muted. I can't hear you, Tanya.
She's muted. She's not a panelist, but I think she understands.
Okay, great. All right. If you didn't understand that, then please email me and I'll try and expand on it further. But it gives us the reading of the entire optical system. So not every topographer does that. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, we're not going to start tomography. Lucky for all of you, we're not going to start tomography today because that has a lot more stuff you have to get your head around. But we'll try and keep it simple for next time. Okay.